Chapter 14, how do we explain the sovereignty of God within the context of natural disasters? You know, watching the news can be a little depressing at times. Forest fires decimating our national parks, sinkholes taking people down to their graves alive, floods destroying people's homes, and droughts that decimate entire ecosystems. So the big million-dollar question is, does God really orchestrate these natural disasters, or is this just Mother Nature doing what Mother Nature does? Well, here's the best way I can explain the sovereignty of God in natural disasters. Over my 30-plus years of doing blue-collar work, I've ran several types of machines that all have some type of an automated switch or a computer chip that tells the machine to do a certain thing a certain way at a certain time, and then repeat the process. Because the programmer knew what the primary function of the machine was, he made it work on a predetermined cycle. Cut, punch, press, grind, buff, repeat cycle. But every machine also had what you would call a manual override button, where the operator could manually override any command that had been programmed into the machine and make it do what it wanted to do for a specific amount of time. Let off the manual override button and we're back into full automation mode. Well, that is the way God works in nature. It's automated most of the time because God has established certain cosmic laws in nature, and they go through a process or a cycle, and then they repeat themselves. And He has positioned the planets to give us our seasons of winter, spring, summer, and fall, and He created things to work on a daily cycle, a weekly cycle, and a yearly cycle. Yes, it was Almighty God that set all that into motion, and He's never changed it. As a matter of fact, all the Jewish feasts and holidays that God gave to Moses were calculated to fall on certain months of the year. And we also see things like generational cycles, where God talks about a certain generation, and the year of the Jubilee was on a 50-year cycle. But God also has a manual override button on the forces of nature, and He can press that button anytime He wants to. And He can use the power of nature to bless us, to wake us up, or to spank us. But how do you know when it's just Mother Nature being Mother Nature, or when God is actually hitting the manual override button? Well, there's more than one answer to that question, and they're all biblical, but just to mention a few. Number one, natural disasters can be a demonstration of God's sovereignty. If you remember, God said to Moses, "Get up early in the morning and stand before Pharaoh and tell him, 'Let my people go. For this time I will send my plagues on you, so that you might know that there is no one like me in all the earth.'" Now, the natural disasters that came upon Egypt were for the sole purpose of showing the most powerful nation on earth at that time that He was the one true God. But God also did this as a punishment for the way they had treated and exploited His chosen people. And the Exodus, and the plundering of the Egyptians was the biblical principle of restitution of property and goods. That we have worked for you for free for the last 400 years, and now it's payback time. So natural disasters can be a demonstration of God's sovereignty. Number two, we simply live in a fallen world, and one of the signs of a fallen world is thorns and thistles that are now going to compete for fertile soil. And the result was hard labor for anyone who worked the soil for His provision. And just remember, they did not have forest fires or hailstorms or tornadoes in the Garden of Eden. Those things were all a result of the fall of man. And the first natural disaster recorded in the Bible was the worldwide universal flood of Noah. Number three, some natural disasters, believe it or not, actually have a silver lining. The irony of a forest fire is that they are the worst and the best thing that can happen to a forest. It takes time, but there's a silver lining. According to all the experts and the things that I've read, a forest fire is Mother Nature's way of regenerating itself. A good forest fire cleans out all the dead vegetation that accumulates on the forest floor and creates a very ideal environment for new growth. Even animals prefer new growth forests. There are even certain species of trees, like a jack pine, that have some unique qualities about them. The pine cone is held together by a thick, gluey resin, and the only way for the jack pine cone to release its seed is by going through a fire. So the fire melts the resin off the pine cone, it opens up, it releases its seed back into the forest floor. And the good news is you come back, 10 years later, and you have, little jack pines, head high, as thick as hair on a dog. And in some cases, the only way to really grow a new forest is to burn the old one down. So, according to Mother Nature, this just has to happen every 200 to 300 years for the forest to stay nice and green. And if this never happened, then the dead stuff would eventually overtake a good portion of the ecosystem and nothing would grow well. So the whole forest floor would just become one thick layer of debris. So a good forest fire also keeps the next forest fire from destroying everything, because all the dead trees and the debris were, eliminated in the previous forest fire. Then the next one does not spell total destruction. So it's a cycle. Number four, sometimes God puts us in charge of the weather. The human element in this equation is that sometimes God lets us put our hand on the manual override button. Let me give you one example. Elijah was a man just like us, and he prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain on the land for 3.5 years. So God put Elijah's hand on the manual override button, and Elijah called for a drought. And 3.5 years later, at his command, it rained again. That's a sacred trust, isn't it? We also have examples of, Elijah making an axe head float and Jesus walking on water, and a man named Philip who was transported in the Spirit to another town. All these things defy the common laws of nature. Number five, sometimes God uses weather as divine judgment. When Jesus was crucified, there was an earthquake. When he rose from the dead, there was an earthquake. And when he comes back and stands on the Mount of Olives, there will be an earthquake again. Is that a coincidence? A guy named John McTernan, in his lecture series, America's Fatal Mistake, documents that every time a nation made a move against Israel, within a few days there was a natural disaster that hit that rival nation. He actually documents 120 same-day events that occurred right after someone raised their hand against Israel. Let me give you one example. On October 30th of 1991, then President George Bush called for a 3-day peace talk in Madrid, Spain, called the Madrid Peace Process. And the day started with negotiations, and he made the comment that we believe that territorial compromise is essential for peace in the Middle East. He made it very clear that Israel was going to have to give up some of their covenant land for peace. And when he started dividing the land of Israel, he interfered with God's prophetic plan. On the exact same day that he did this, a freakish storm erupted in the North Atlantic called the Perfect Storm, which they eventually made a movie out of. And there were 3 weather patterns called a retrograde storm that all came together and created a hurricane on the northern east coast. And it was the most powerful storm ever recorded in the North Atlantic. And this storm traveled backwards over 1,000 miles in an east to west direction, which is odd because weather always moves from, in a west to east fashion. But George Bush had a private home in Kennebunkport, Maine. And that storm sent 30-foot waves into his house and absolutely destroyed it. And understand, this happened on the same day he was negotiating the Madrid peace process. And God said, "You touched my land, now I'm going to touch your land." And this is a storm that only happens about once every 100 years. Number 6, sometimes God put Israel in charge of the weather. In Deuteronomy chapter 28, which I consider to be one of the richest chapters in the Bible, it spells out the blessings and curses of either doing things God's way or rejecting his counsel. And Moses made it very clear that God's favor over a nation is reflected in weather patterns that bring prosperity or poverty. And that is why the first word in Deuteronomy chapter 28 is the word if. Because the whole chapter is based on a conditional response, if, and if. Matter of fact, verse 1, "If you fully obey the Lord your God, I will set you high above all the nations of the earth." He goes on to say here, I'm just going to do a few sound bites. The fruit of your womb will be blessed, and your crops and your land will be blessed. The Lord will send a blessing on your barns and everything you put your hand to. The Lord will open up the heavens and the storehouse of his bounty to send rain on your land in season and to bless all the work of your hands. You will lend to many nations and borrow from none. But then in about verse 15, he switches gears and he says, "But if you do not obey the Lord your God, these are the curses that will come upon you." And look at how many of these have to do with weather patterns or natural provision. He says, "Your fruit basket and your kneading trough will be cursed and empty. The Lord will turn rain into dust. You will sow a lot of seed, but harvest very little because the locusts will devour it. You will plant vineyards and not eat of its fruit because the worms will eat them. You see, this means that Israel shared a steering wheel with God, and our obedience can determine his favor over a nation. Have you ever noticed that there are just certain nations that just have a lot of natural disasters, a lot of poverty, a lot of disease? But these places also seem to be a safe haven for crime, political corruption, exploitation of women and children, etc. Number 7, how do you determine if a natural disaster is from God or just nature? Well, here is one answer. I guess sometimes it depends on what side of the natural disaster that you are on. You know, the plagues of hail and fire that came upon the Egyptians were all announced ahead of time, by Moses. So when they came to pass, it would have been hard to say that they were just coincidence. And the Egyptians saw them obviously as a natural disaster, but the Israelites saw them as the judgment of God over their oppressors, which is a perfect lead into my next point. How many of you remember the Black Plague in the mid-1300s? This was during a political system that they referred to as serfs and feudal lords. Now, feudalism was a system of government based on the ownership of land. And the feudal lord would provide the serf or the peasant farmer with a small piece of land, and in exchange for that, the feudal lord provided the serf with protection. Okay? So one of the myths, though, of the Black Plague is that it killed most of the poor. Well, the reason that's not true is because there were way more serfs than there were feudal lords, so naturally the numbers would be higher. But the serfs saw the Black Plague as the judgment of God on their feudal lords for how they'd been treated. Many of them actually felt like God had led them out of bondage and put them in power over the people who had once oppressed them. Now, does that story ring a bell? Yeah, it's the Exodus. Now, many of them simply took over the farm when their feudal lord died because they saw it as restitution for the money they should have been paid all along. And during the 4 years that the Black Plague ravaged Europe, there were over 1,000 villages that were completely abandoned and just left for the taking. And if you remember in the Exodus experience, let me just read you this one verse. The Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed towards the people and gave them what they asked for, and so they plundered the Egyptians. You see, restitution of property and goods. Now, there were even, going back to this plague though, there were even monasteries that were shut down because so many people died. And this added fuel to the idea that the plague was God's judgment because the plague was no respecter of persons. You see, even the holy places of worship were not totally spared. But the Black Plague is what ultimately set the stage for the peasant revolt in 1381. And without the momentum of the Black Plague and the leadership vacuum it created in the upper class, the common man may never have been liberated from the system of serfs and feudal lords. And some scholars even believe that the shift in power after the plague is what really set the stage for Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation. So the takeaway from this lesson would be that if God did not orchestrate these sad events, he can always redeem them. Number 8. Let's talk about theological cliches for a minute. One of the biggest issues I have with the modern church is what I call theological cliches, and one of the worst ones is that every time something goes wrong with the weather, this was an act of God. Let's talk about that. You know, my first real job was working at a water plant, and I asked my boss one time, what do you do when the plant gets overloaded with more water than what it can handle? Well, he said, I'm not in any trouble because as far as OSHA is concerned, it's an act of God. Well, I'm sure since 1981, they've probably changed the wordage on that, but, when I was a kid, anytime there was a natural disaster, it was always recorded, but even by the government, as an act of God. But see, there's a serious threat of hypocrisy in that because when you have 10 good years of weather and nothing bad happens, for some reason it's never recorded in the history books as an act of God. Okay, but in the absence of a logical answer, God always seems to be a convenient scapegoat. Let's just go blame it on Almighty God. So be very careful to never ascribe to God what is just fallen nature making a big mess. Number 7, how does the world see this dilemma? Have you ever heard of a game called Pocket God? It's one of the top-selling video game applications for Apple's iPhone. And here's the game's description that I found on iTunes. What kind of a God would you be? Benevolent or vengeful? Play Pocket God and discover the answer within yourself. On a remote island, you are the all-powerful God that rules over the primitive islanders. You can bring new life and then take it away just as quickly. Exercise your powers on the islanders, lift them in the air, alter gravity, hit them with lightning. You're the island god. All God powers are demonstrated in Pocket God's help menu. Now, if that isn't bad enough, they actually give you what's called game options that include throwing islanders into volcanoes, using islanders as shark bait, bowling for islanders, and creating earthquakes to destroy the islanders. Wow. The obvious implication, God is just an evil dictator waiting to use the powers of nature to inflict pain upon someone that he rules over. Let me just say, from a pastor's perspective, that is a horrible, sad representation of the old rugged cross. That Jesus came and died for our sins. He came to bless us and not to curse us. And the same thing is true with nature. God created nature to bless us and not to curse us. Last point. The Billingsgate Gazette reported that a wonderful treasure was discovered on the beaches of Florida in 2004. And a guy came across 180 near-mint condition Spanish silver coins worth more than $40,000. And the coins were from a Spanish treasure fleet that was destroyed by a hurricane in 1715. And now 300 years later, another hurricane uncovered a small portion of the original shoreline where the treasure was lost. The point being, it took another hurricane to open up the earth and reveal the lost treasure hidden inside. I really believe that sometimes God uses the storms of life to strip away the shoreline of pain and rejection and stagnation and the things that hold us back in life, only to expose the lost treasure that is hidden on the inside of us. I hope this helps.